Hi everybody, Dr. Flamand here. I am happy to introduce to you today's lecture topic on American immigration, which I'm subtitling Enduring Controversies and Recent Developments. So I guess everyone here is familiar with the notion that America is a nation of immigrants. And indeed, I think there's no getting around the fact that in many ways immigration sits at the center of both North American history and its contemporary societies, including the United States. In recent years, anxieties about immigration seem to have taken center stage in national politics and culture, and increasingly these debates are mirrored in the European context, especially as it struggles with recent waves of refugees and migrants fleeing tough situations in Africa and the Middle East. Therefore, I think immigration appears as an especially topical issue worthy of being addressed and analyzed in great depth, especially in a program which is, an American Studies program based in Europe. So in recent years, the immigrant population in the USA has been approaching a high point not seen in nearly 100 years, and it's expected to continue to rise. So, you might want to stop for a minute when having a look at these graphs. You might want to stop the presentation and just have a quick look at them. But it's worth noting that, at around 54 million people, immigrants now make up around 14 to 15% of the population of the United States, making it the home to about 20% of all the immigrants in the world. Around 10 million or one quarter of those are, what are sometimes called illegal, but I'll prefer to call unauthorized immigrants. So social scientists often distinguish between two different kinds of forces, social forces, which inspire immigrants to pick up and move. These are push and pull factors. Push factors are things that, drive people away from their place of origin. This includes things like fleeing political repression, taking refuge from violence and war. While pull factors, the things that attract them to a new place, right, include, economic opportunities such as jobs, as well as personal reasons like reuniting with loved ones and family members who had previously immigrated. Um, you can kind of get an idea just by looking at the slide that this is not a complete list, but that the motivations are mixed, right? Are often complicated for any one individual person. So immigrants are a key part of the American national community, not just because of their size, but also because they have been among the most influential and energetic contributors to American life over the centuries, right? They include politicians, celebrities, scientists, activists, inventors. 34 of the 122 Americans who won a Nobel Prize from 2000 to 2018, for example, were immigrants. Four of the five Americans who won Nobels in 2016 alone were born outside the country. Eight of the 41 Fortune 500 companies created since 1985 had an immigrant founder. Immigrants have historically and continue today to be perhaps the major contributors to building American power and prestige, or at least among the major contributors. And it's for this reason that Americans generally feel great pride in the notion of being a nation of immigrants. Even so, immigration remains one of the most enduring, contentious topics of debate in American politics. Of late, it's been of special pertinence, as you can see from the Gallup poll, which indicates a growing concern with immigration as, quote, a most important problem facing America today. Right? So immigration is both a kind of source of pride and a source of anxiety. Curiously, the same poll also found that a rising majority of Americans are beginning to see immigration as a good thing overall. What this indicates is that American attitudes towards immigration are complex to say the least. Many Americans like to celebrate their own immigrant heritage, but are not always welcoming to newcomers in their own day and age. So for the rest of this lecture, what I want to do is to kind of advance and support a simple yet I think important thesis, which I've broken down into three parts here, right? So my claims here are going to be one, that contemporary immigration debates are often informed less by facts and more by a set of cultural mythologies, images, and narratives with deep historical roots. The second claim will be that the terms in which immigration debates are carried out are deeply indebted to this history, even as participants in this debate are often unaware of it. And the third thing I'll kind of argue is that exploring the history of American immigration can provide us with a deeper understanding of the stakes of these contemporary debates happening um, right now, right? I'm going to support this thesis first by outlining what I view as some of the key recurrent themes which tend to frame both contemporary and historical immigration debates. I want to then kind of move on in the second part of the lecture to look at a few moments in American immigration history. And finally, I'm going to try to tie these historical issues to contemporary developments in the American immigration debates. So I'll start by diving into some of these key themes. So I guess that most of you are familiar with this poem, which is The New Colossus by Emma Lazarus, which we will discuss a little bit in the seminars. So this poem, it adorns the base of the Statue of Liberty, which was originally a gift given by the French to commemorate French and American relations since the Revolutionary War. Lazarus's poem, paired with the statue's close proximity to the now defunct federal immigration station at Ellis Island, helped to motivate the popular image of the statue as, in Lazarus's word, the quote, mother of exiles, who welcomes the fleeing oppressed masses of Europe to the golden door of American opportunity. Indeed, Lazarus's words are by many considered to be an iconic statement of the American creed. Lazarus's words found their way into the news a couple years back when a Trump official took it upon himself to rewrite them during an interview with NPR in what I think was a very poor attempt to justify a policy shift in how applicants for permanent residency would be assessed. What I think the statement attempted to do was perpetuate, or at least play into, a set of mythologies surrounding the notion that immigrants are freeloaders, that the purpose for which they immigrate is to take advantage of free public services while not paying taxes and thus represent a burden on the American taxpayer. I'll have more to say about these kinds of attitudes briefly. For now, it's worth noting as well that these questions about who is worthy and who is unworthy, who is a freeloader and who is a contributor, are themselves even more deeply entangled with a sense of fear and resentment of the other, and namely with the concern that especially those immigrants fleeing bad situations abroad would bring them their problems with them, right? So let's stop for a moment and look a little bit about at these two cartoons, one from 1896 and one which is more contemporary. The first one reads, strangers at our gates, and you have an immigrant asking Uncle Sam if he can come in, and Uncle Sam saying, I suppose you can, there's no law to keep you out, right? But he doesn't look very happy about it, right? And if you see all the baggage that this immigrant is, personification of immigrants is carrying, he has a bag called poverty, disease, desecration. And on the second hand, you see kind of all of these same kind of anxieties present in another contemporary cartoon by Ben Garrison, but also kind of playing to the notion of political polarization, right? The kind of notion that um, the idea that the Democrats want to kind of introduce unskilled and uneducated and undeserving people into the U.S. because they think that it will garner them votes, right? Um, a fourth and I think connected matter of contention here is the kind of debate about the economic impact of immigration. So many people assume that immigration is a simple right-left issue, with Republicans being anti-immigration and Democrats pro. You saw that in the last political cartoon. But the reality is much more complicated than that. While contemporary Republicans often complain that immigrants take from public services without contributing taxes, there's also this kind of notion which is on the right as well as the left, especially what I might call an old left attitude, which is about worrying that immigrants depress the wages of lower skilled native-born Americans. I think there's ample economic evidence that both of these claims are, for the most part, wrong, and I'll talk about that later in the lecture. But for here, it's worth kind of pointing out that this kind of anti-immigration economic rhetoric was endorsed by Bernie Sanders in 2015, right? So this is not a simple right-left issue. The fifth kind of thing I want to draw your attention to is this kind of trope of the melting pot, which is a common idea for representing the idea of cultural assimilation, right? So this is a trope that was popularized, if not invented, by Israeli Zangwill, who was himself a Jewish immigrant from England. And as many have noted, this myth relies upon the assumption of a certain cultural and social leveling, in which newcomers are expected to adopt the standards of white middle-class Anglo-American respectability, basically just to become exactly like those who are already there before you, right? Um, and you can see in these excerpt from The Melting Pot, which was a stage play, um, the kind of notion or this almost aggrandized notion of um, bringing the peoples of the world together and melting them down in the cauldron of American culture and kind of transforming them into good Americans. And that's kind of leaving behind their, older um, cultures and their older traditions. So the kind of perceived slow pace at which this assimilation happens, um, if we can call it assimilation, I think assimilation is a poor word, in fact, for anything in culture. But in any event, it often sparks, this anxiety that immigrants either won't or don't want to or simply can't assimilate, right? Indeed, more so perhaps than sentimental attachments to the home country, kind of enclaving tendencies of immigrant communities where ethnic newcomers tend to move into the same parts of big cities and associate closely with each other, largely because of family ties or social ties that were, created in the homeland. This has widely been interpreted as a reticence to assimilate, right? Um, so you see this here, kind of these anxieties manifest in these two political cartoons. It's kind of just to share a story with you, this is also, I think, a big thing in Europe right now, right? So one police academy instructor I spoke with in Germany several years back referred to his Turkish and Arab colleagues, right, his fellow police officers, as living in a, quote, parallel society. And certain immigrant communities in the United States throughout history have been accused of the same. And I think what's often missed here is the kind of social function of enclave communities, right? Immigrants tend to move into the same areas. They tend to stick with each other because it provides communal support and assistance, right? Sometimes it's as much about necessity as choice. Sometimes they get pushed by the practices of, um, you know, um, landlords or those dealing in real estate into certain areas, right? Um, so therefore it's just as often as not also an effect of discriminatory practices in housing and employment markets, right? Which often marginalize many first generation immigrants. Um, and it also, enclaves also serve as a kind of anchor community. It mitigates the detrimental forces, it creates neighborhood cohesion. Um, you know, that they end up in low rent districts also means that they have a tendency to revitalize areas which were perhaps suffering from economic stagnation and urban decay before they arrived, right? So I think that this notion of assimilation and the anxieties surround it are a little bit overly simplistic, to say the least. Perhaps more useful for us to think about is a notion of cultural pluralism, or what today goes by the name sometimes of multiculturalism, right? So cultural pluralism celebrates diversity as a cornerstone of a healthy and vibrant social ecology. And it usually views immigration as necessary to rejuvenate and enrich otherwise bland mainstream cultures. Here I have a quote from Horace Kalin, one of the founders of the New School for Social Research in New York City, who you will read for the seminar this week, and who in this excerpt here imagines civilization to be a symphony played by an orchestra in which each instrument represents a different ethnic group, right? Um, so you see here the kind of notion of pluralism being about a society which becomes more than the sum of its kind of culturally constituted parts, right? with different ethnic communities, with different immigrant groups, with in any one country, kind of being part of what he calls the symphony of civilization. So if we think about what we've already talked about, I think we can already just start to distill some of this into a few key themes. And for simplicity's sake, on this slide and the next, I've kind of grouped them into pro and anti-immigration frames. So, think about the language going on here, right? So you can think about economic stimulus, right? Demographic population issues. Having a larger population is usually related to having a larger GDP. Having a reserve labor force. This can be just kind of about having people there to do jobs that native born won't do or don't want to do or refuse to do. The notion of high contribution, low obligation, right? So that immigrants bring a lot, right? And in the end, there might not be a lot of obligation to serve them in ways that you have to the native born population, although I wonder if that's a good thing. Um, there's also a notion of social cultural assets, right? So that they enrich the cultural fabric, right? They bring good food, they bring interesting traditions, they bring new perspectives, right, on the world. This notion of human capital and knowledge transfer. In recent years, most of the people, not most of, but very high levels of people coming to the United States have been coming to fill jobs in like academics or research or the corporate world. Yeah, immigrants are thought to self-select for aspiration, right? So generally, the people who take the time to try to pick up and move to a new place, they have high levels of aspiration, and the whole notion then that by like allowing people to come who are highly driven to succeed, you in a sense revitalize the American dream overall. Of course, you also have common anti-immigration frames, which are also, interestingly enough, usually kind of filtered through, again, an economic rhetoric. For here, example, not stimulus and asset, but burden and liability, right? So the notion that um, that immigrants crowd out native workers, right? That they lower or depress wages, that they are free riders. We talked about that, and that they are easy to exploit, especially if they are undocumented and afraid of bringing a dispute with an employer to the courts or to the police, right? They can very easily be cheated. There's also the notion of socio-cultural liability, right? People think that they're less educated on average, although I think that's increasingly not the case. Um, the notion that they bring their problems with them, that if they're coming from a place with low levels of social cohesion and a lot of violence, that they're somehow going to transmit that violence. It's almost a strange, interestingly enough, in our moment of kind of pandemic moment, this kind of viral notion of how problems enter society as if outsiders bring the problems instead of the societies themselves generating them. It's a notion that they don't share our values. That should be, sorry about that, should be an R, not a T. And this notion that they refuse to assimilate, which I think is also, uh, yeah, problematic to say the least. So now I want to turn for a moment to some key moments in American immigration history. So here I've laid out the policy regimes used in the reading you had from today by Ewing. As you can see, immigration on the federal level at least remained fairly unrestricted until the later quarter of the 19th century, when the first exclusion laws were passed and the federal government started taking over the job of managing immigration. What you see since then, I think, are two tendencies. One is a drastic concentration in immigration due to a quota system that was uh, uh, um, started kind of around the 1920s, um, and then a reopening, although I think not a complete reopening in 1965. The other is what I think we might call a gradual hardening of immigration policy and a focus on centralized control, which not only attempts to kind of get a grip on the flow of people into the US, but also attempts to both surveil and constrict the rights of those people, both at the border and as they enter. Again, I'll talk about this a bit more in the final section. I don't want to go too deep into it because you were supposed to read this short paper by Ewing for today's session. Instead of just rehashing the policy regime approach taken by Ewing, I want to approach immigration through another frame in this section and instead focus on important waves of immigration. Of course, these two things, the policy regime side and the kind of actual waves of immigration, are intrinsically linked, and I think that will become clear along the way. So scholars generally identify three major waves of immigration, and historians have tended to label these waves old, new, and modern immigration. The first, which starts around the late 1930s and lasts until the onset of the Civil War in 1861, corresponds to a period of famine and civil unrest in Europe. Indeed, during this time, a lot of Irish and Germans immigrated to the U.S. seeking relief from these kinds of issues. So, many Germans who arrived during this period moved to the frontier and became farmers or gained a foothold as artisans or pub owners, but they nevertheless provoked a fair amount of disdain from their native-born neighbors, right? For perceived as being different or lesser or of worse stock than those who trace their ancestry, either real or imaginary, back to um, the kind of more Anglo English kind of waves of immigration um, during, for example, the colonial period. But the Irish, I think, tended to draw even more disdain, right? So many of those who fled Ireland during the Great Potato Famine were heavily impoverished provincial peasants. And although many also set out to seek their fortune on the American frontier, uh, a great deal more, I think, tended to cluster in major cities. And the kind of spectacle of impoverished Irish peasants crowding the streets of American cities provoked, let's just say, feelings of disdain and anxiety amongst the kind of native population who viewed themselves as more respectable. And Americans often viewed the Irish through a lens they inherited through the English, right? And thus associated them with things like nationalist uprisings and peasant revolts, scary stuff, right? And they were often characterized as being little more than boisterous, brawling drunkards. And if you look at this political cartoon here, you kind of see some of that at play. You also see kind of, I would say, a racialization of the Irish, the tendency to depict them um, as apes, much in the same way as some at the time tended to depict, for example, African Americans. So while you saw immigrants coming from Europe to the eastern coast of the country, you also saw on the other side, on the western side of the country, especially in the newly admitted state of California, it began to attract thousands of immigrants, especially in the wake of the California gold rush of the 1840s. And this included largely Chinese immigrants who joined in and provided valuable labor in mines and farms and even helped construct the railroad lines which connected the west and east coasts. And that kind of transportation infrastructure was very important for helping develop American wealth, right, and also to integrate the nation in terms of communication. However, when that region, the West, kind of started to experience an economic slump in the 1870s, many white workers took their frustrations out on the Chinese immigrants, often violently, right? So if you have a look at these two political cartoons here, you see these kinds of um, you know, usually we would think about monopolies in terms of big industry, right? In terms of the robber barons of the period, in terms of Standard Oil, who were kind of buying up all of the, basically taking up all the market share in one industry. Here you see kind of the Chinese who were considered industrious, right? And hardworking being portrayed as monopolizing lower skilled labor, low wage, low skilled jobs from white Americans. And you see here this kind of notion, what shall we do with our boys? Or the coming man. You see the Chinese immigrant being depicted in highly racialized terms and also as an octopus, right? And an octopus was a common way to that big monopolies were portrayed as having like their tentacles in all areas of American politics and business and life. And here you have that kind of reproduced and projected upon these Chinese immigrants in the way in which they monopolize all those services and take jobs from the foreign born. So you also saw kind of uh, sense of competition coming from between different immigrant or ethnic groups of the time, right? So ironically, one of the principal anti-immigrant or anti-Chinese spokesmen during the time was the Irish-born David Carney, right? Who was this powerful orator who infamously ended every address with a declaration that, quote, whatever happens, the Chinese must go, right? And you see that kind of rhetoric reproduced here in this political cartoon from the Wasp. Um, which also kind of says, if you look at it, you see different kind of native-born Americans relying on the services, right, of the Chinese immigrants. Um, you also see here another political cartoon with a kind of what looks like a kind of caricature of an Irish immigrant telling basically a Chinese immigrant that he has to go. Um, so you see here these kinds of interesting ways in which race begins to cohere uh, around different ethnic groups, so that, for example, the Irish kind of aspiring to whiteness, grouping themselves in with others, and kind of trying to exclude the Chinese who they see themselves maybe in competition with over jobs. And also, I would maybe also say prestige on some level. So, anti-Chinese sentiment kind of resulted in the first federal legislation concerning immigration in the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. It was the first of many laws, which you see here, which utilized state power to define the demographic and cultural character of the nation. Importantly, the law barred Chinese laborers, not all immigration, right? Just laborers. So merchants, students, Chinese American citizens were not supposed to be barred, but the standard enforcement practices of immigration officials who held these kind of racist notions that the Chinese were especially tricky people, right? Generally assumed that Chinese travelers were lying and put them through onerous documentation and interrogation procedures. Um, yeah, we'll talk about these other acts briefly in a minute. So here you'll notice the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act and the 1892 Gary Act are rather important to this moment. So it's interesting to note that also many of you know that when many Chinese immigrants began arriving, successfully found a foothold in things like vegetable farming in California, right? Nativist forces also tried to evict them from their lands, and farmers quite cleverly responded by registering their holdings in the names of their native-born American children, right? So people found interesting ways around this kind of unjust policies. However, as you know, especially the Japanese immigrant community found itself under attack during World War II when they were rounded up and forced into internment camps. Um, it's worth noting that many officials praised, I think, pretty perversely the Japanese for cooperating with this internment regime. And many second generation Japanese Americans fought in World War II, even as their parents and families were held in internment. If you're interested in that history, you can research the history of the 442nd Infantry Regiment of the U.S. Army, which I think is a pretty astounding tale. So I think it's worth noting the ways in which Asian Americans in particular kind of face a two-pronged attack when it comes to cultural stereotypes, right? So you guys all probably remember during the early kind of months of the pandemic, Donald Trump trying to associate it with China and with Chinese people by calling it the Wuhan flu or the Chinese flu. Um, there's also a heightened level of attacks, hate crimes against Asian Americans since the beginning of the pandemic. So there are these old associations. We'll talk about that in a minute with immigration and disease. Um, and so, there's that. And then on the other hand, they're often celebrated as a kind of model minority, right? Which is quick to assimilate, eager to succeed, which does really well in business, whatever it might be. And as many have pointed out, not only does this kind of model minority stereotype conflate what is in fact a hugely complex demographic segment, right? There's not just Asian Americans, there's all kinds of small ethnic groups, right? There's different nationalities, there's ethnic groups within countries. They all have they're all very different. Nevertheless, there's this kind of unreasonably high expectation of all Asian Americans, expectations which I would note that white Americans are not expected to live up to, right? And furthermore, many Asian American communities, I think, continue to struggle to find a foothold in American society, and I think this is due in part to this phenomenon of white flight, right? When Asian Americans start to appear in neighborhoods, much like with African American Americans as well, white residents assume that this is going to cause their property values to suffer, and they leave, which of course means property values lower. And they take also tax dollars of businesses with them when they leave, right? So Asian Americans are, I think, kind of caught between these two narratives. On the one hand, they're seen simultaneously as the invaders with whom whites have to compete, and as the model by which all other immigrants are judged and ultimately found wanting. So next I want to kind of turn to what's often called new European immigration, which occurred around the 1880s, 1890s, up until the 1920s. So here you see a chart detailing the shift in origins of Europeans coming to the U.S. from 1870 to 1820. Um, if you look closely, right, you'll see that kind of old immigration is very North and West European, and you'll find that the newer waves are often coming from the South and the East of Europe, right? Places where, people might have been considered what's sometimes called off-white, right? They're white, but they're not quite as white as Northern or Western Europeans, and therefore kind of carried with them these kind of loose racial associations. So I think it's worth looking closely for a minute at these photographs by the great photographer Lewis Hine, who famously cataloged these pictures of Ellis Island, which was the first federal import hub for immigrants, where boatloads of incoming arrivals were evaluated, processed, and registered, often by officials who could not and had little interest in pronouncing or misspelling their names, right? Um, I really like Hines Ellis Island photography, and I think it's appreciated greatly because it's especially meaning laden, right? So, um, you know, photography is not just kind of indexing what happened, right? Photographers always make choices about how they take pictures, right? How they frame a photo, who they photograph, at what moment, from which angles, right? So if you look at these two great iconic images here, one called Climbing into America, right? You have just through choosing to take a picture of immigrants ascending a stairway, you have this notion of ascending into the American dream, right? Of social mobility kind of already occurring the moment that they step foot into um, um, Ellis Island, right? You also have the Italian Madonna, right? Um, which is, I think, a great picture. Is kind of evokes a lot of sentimentality. Madonna, of course, being a name for the Virgin Mary. So it's kind of Christian overlay of kind of like Christian tropes onto the choice of how to frame a photograph like that. I think was very interesting. Yeah. So it's worth thinking briefly about why Ellis Island was opened as a kind of central immigration hub to the United States, whereas prior to that, people would just arrive to whatever state they wanted to go to. And so prior to the opening of Ellis Island, the individual states managed immigration, but many public officials feared that incoming migrants might bring contagious diseases like cholera, right? So Ellis Island opened in part as a central inspection station to ensure that the sick, the infirm, or basically anyone who might become a, quote, public charge, referring back to something we saw in previous slides, right, were not admitted to the country. So Eastern European immigrants did not all stay in cities, right? Many of them kind of moved off to the frontier, but they were, I think, most visible in urban areas where they could depend upon enclave communities of other immigrants who spoke their languages, could help them find jobs, who would in general provide a support network, right? However, many view these communities as backwards, right? Peasant communities, culturally and genetically inferior to Western and Northern Europeans, all kinds of stuff, yeah. So conditions in these cities were unsanitary, to say the least, right? It's after all the 19th century, or the early 20th century. Um, And here you see kind of a horse which has fallen dead in the streets. It was not uncommon for a week or more to pass before public authorities came to clean something like that up, especially in poor immigrant areas. And moreover, immigrants were often exploited for their labor, and entire families, including children, would often work grueling hours in dangerous factory jobs to pay often criminally high rents. The muckraking journalist and novelist Upton Sinclair famously described these conditions in a work of journalistic fiction, a novel called The Jungle. The novel is most well known for graphic depictions of unsanitary conditions in Chicago's meatpacking district. Here's a brief passage from the book. I'll read it out loud briefly. So, quote, worst of any, however, were the fertilizer men and those who served in the cooking rooms. These people could not be shown to the visitor, for the odor of a fertilizer man would scare any ordinary visitor at 100 yards. And as for the other men who worked in tank rooms full of steam, and in some of which there were open vats near the levels of the floor, their peculiar trouble was that they fell into the vats. And then when they were fished out, there was never enough of them left to be worth exhibiting. Sometimes they would be overlooked for days, till all but the bones of them had gone out to the world as dirhams, pure leaf lard. So Sinclair intended this book to be an indictment of industrial exploitation of immigrants and the working class, right? However, it was instead rightly read as an expose of the unsanitary conditions of meatpacking factories and helped to spur the first federal food safety regulations, right? Which is good, but Sinclair famously later noted that, quote, I aimed at the public's heart, and by accidentally I hit it in the stomach, right? You can see by the kind of reception of this book, right, and the fact that it was read as a indictment of um, poor food safety regulations instead of as an indictment of the exploitation of immigrants in the working class. Let's just say it says something about the attitudes of those in power at the time. So many influential people, industrialists, and so forth, didn't really want to get rid of these new immigrants, right? After all, they provided cheap labor, and you could, well, put them in poor conditions and let them fall into vats of boiling stuff if you wanted to. It's horrible. Instead, they wanted to kind of work on assimilating them, right, and mold them into, quote, good Americans, right? Many others, right, including progressive social reformers of the time, who sought to improve society, um, you know, wanted to improve like the structural conditions, um, and also do so by molding the culture of the poor and foreign, right, giving them good habits, educating them, and so forth. So one of the principal places for this is the schoolhouse, right? Um, think about it, right? What's the first and foremost job of a public school besides teaching you to count and read? Well, it's to kind of fashion your identity. It's to teach you the history of the place you're from. It's to socialize you into the nation state, yeah, to make you a good citizen, yeah. Um, so there's a kind of indoctrination, I think, at work here, especially when it comes to the indoctrination of immigrant children. Um, it also kind of makes me think about the kind of boarding schools that Native American children were sometimes sent to after being kidnapped from their families or their own kind of native communities. Um, this has been in the news recently as well, especially with regard to Native American boarding schools, which turned out to be, in some cases, very horrible places where many people died. But in the case of public schools in the city center, right, usually the treatment was much better. The whole idea was simply to kind of like purge the young white children of their bad European backgrounds and kind of assimilate them, right, into kind of the what was considered the mainstream Protestant white U.S. society at the time. At least one great social progressive reformer of the time, however, thought that this formula was a bit backwards. Yeah, so the social worker Jane Addams, who founded the Whole House, which was a community improvement center, and sought to educate and improve the prospects of poor immigrants living in Chicago's slums, had this to say in her address to the National Education Association in 1908, quote, "We send young people to Europe to see Italy, but we do not utilize Italy when it lies about the schoolhouse. the body of teachers in our great cities could take hold of the immigrant colonies, their handicrafts and occupations, their traditions, their folk songs and folklore, the beautiful stories, and get the children to bring these things into school as the material from which culture is made and the material upon which culture was based. They would discover that by comparison, that which they give them now is a poor, meretricious, and vulgar thing, right? Um, so, it's worth thinking about this notion of cultural pluralism at work here, right? That by injecting difference into a community, you in fact, in a sense, revitalize it. Yeah, um, we might think about that in terms of, think about your own friend circle, right? How many people, especially in a university, come from all parts of the world, and think about the perspectives they bring. And the ways in which they kind of um, enrich all aspects of our lives. Um, so over time, I think as immigrants began to make up more and more of the population of the USA, labor unions and social conservatives became increasingly opposed to unrestricted immigration. Some labor unions were saying did try to actively court immigrants, right? But others did not. And many workers feared that immigrants lowered their wages and took their jobs. Some workers even resented immigrants for succeeding against all odds. Yeah, and some labor leaders speculated that immigrants were so inferior that they were incapable of organizing. Right. So some courted immigrants, and others thought, wow, they had such racist notions of them that they just kind of wrote them off altogether. This seems to be the case, for example, when immigrants were used as strikebreakers or scabs by industrialists during labor disputes, right? What these critics, I think, missed, however, is that immigrants were often completely new to the country and had no clue about its politics, right? You have to, if you want to organize newcomers, you have to kind of like introduce them to the political situation. Yeah, you can't just expect them to immediately fall on your side of the political divide, or to be useful for organizing if you don't organize with them. Yeah. So immigration slowed to a standstill once the U.S. entered World War One. The war aggravated anti-immigrant sentiment, which persisted even after the war ended. Many began claiming that the new immigrants, many of whom were Catholics and Jews, were culturally and even racially inferior, and the Ku Klux Klan in particular enjoyed a period of renewed popularity during this period. It grew in membership. It became a national force by the 1920s. Um, you know, you might take notice of the slogan on the banner they're carrying on this picture on the left-hand side. This rising tide of nativism was stoked by paranoid suspicions that immigrants harbored racial, anti-American political opinions. Yeah, and many conspiracy theorists suggested that they were sleeper cells of anarchists and communists plotting the violent overthrow of the U.S. Right? You can see this in the political cartoon on the right. So, as a result of these waves of anti-immigrant sentiment, the early 1920s witnessed the introduction of what's commonly called the quota system. Um, If you look at the political cartoon at the right-hand side, you get a pretty good idea of what's going on, right? So there were two quota acts, one of 1921 and one of 1924, which severely limited the amount of immigrants who were allowed to enter the country from certain areas, right? Um, and if you look at this political cartoon, I think it does a good job of showing what happens when the quota system is lowered, right? That you had what was perceived to be a very large onrush of Europeans and then a funnel created, right? Just to let in a few. Um, so what the introduction of these acts meant is that after the 1920s, immigration to the US slowed to a trickle. However, with the onset of World War II and the mass mobilization of the labor force to fight in Europe and the Pacific, America's farmers found themselves in desperate need of laborers. The result was the 1942 Bracero Agreement, which allowed Mexican nationals to work as temporary agricultural workers to fill wartime labor shortages. The program lasted for about 22 years and offered employment to 5 million migrants in 24 U.S. states, the largest foreign worker program in U.S. history. Over time, however, U.S. agricultural employers became increasingly dependent on migrant workers, especially when returning World War II veterans opted to follow other career paths or to attend university. Moreover, the strict controls and bureaucracies surrounding the Bracero Agreement proved onerous, and employers and workers alike often found it easier to circumvent the rules altogether and entered into illegal, sometimes simply verbal work arrangements. Eventually, federal officials in the Eisenhower administration became concerned about the growing numbers of undocumented workers and mobilized police throughout the Southwest to execute a drastic deportation sweep of immigrant neighborhoods. The demeaning name of the program, Operation Wetback, says a lot about how the government regarded these workers. Officers arrested and deported any Mexican-looking person who couldn't immediately produce papers, in many cases even managing to deport American-born children as well as their parents. Um, by some counts, the amount of deportations surpassed 1 million. Even so, while the program taxed local resources and terrorized countless communities, it did little to ebb the tide of unauthorized immigration. Illegal entries exploded again, especially after the U.S. terminated the Bracero program in 1964 and replaced it with a new regime. Which brings us to 1965, when Congress passed the Immigration and Nationality Act. If you're interested in this is more or less the legal regime or one of the legal regimes which continues to kind of determine how immigration works in the U.S. today. And I put up as recommended listening, a podcast which discusses the kind of fallout of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. What the act did is it abolished the quota system of the 1920s in favor of a total yearly cap on individual countries, right? Notably, Mexico's total cap fell drastically. And moreover, the act placed a preference on family reunification on the one hand, right? So you're more likely to be able to immigrate if you already had family there. And the needs of U.S. employers on the other, right? So basically visas given because there's maybe a shortage of a certain skill or employers need a certain workforce. And you see the kind of U.S. immigration population shifting as a result of this over time, right? Um, yeah, so there's basically a drastic shift in the composition of the total immigrant population as well as the complexion, right, interestingly, of the average immigrant. So today, European immigration makes up only a small percentage of immigration to the US overall, while immigration from places like Southeast Asia or China or Latin America increasingly, although it's not shown here, um, on you see it kind of reflected in this graph rather than in these maps. Um, they tend to make up the bulk of the immigrants now going to the U.S. Suffice it to say for now that these trends have served to stir up a fair amount of anxiety amongst a small but very vocal minority of white native-born Americans, including in our own contemporary moment. So I'd say that the most paranoid among those in the USA and Europe had kind of propagated what's often called the replacement conspiracy, or they call it the replacement theory, arguing that their culture is in danger. What white culture is, I'm not really sure what white culture is, right? But anyway, they say that. Um, and in their most extreme variants, they have claimed that powerful government interests are trying to replace freedom-loving whites with poor, servile, colored immigrants, right? Um, so you can kind of see in our contemporary moment that the debate around immigration is still a highly contentious one, a racialized one, right? It tends to, the politics tend to revolve not simply around issues of kind of what's the best economic interest for the various parties involved, but also it comes with and it carries a lot of these kind of stereotypes and racialized anxieties, which I think make it very difficult to have a coherent conversation about immigration and immigration reform in our current moment. So this brings me to my section conclusion, right? So while the specific challenges of immigration policy have changed over the decades, right, and the policies have changed, the problems have changed, right, and contemporary debates tend to recall enduring cultural narratives, tropes, and habits, right. In particular, what may be seen as legitimate economic concerns often blur into and get filtered through pre-existing racial and class resentments. All of which, of course, brings us up to the 21st century and the present day. So, if you talk with folks nowadays, especially Americans, they might argue that they're not against immigration, they're against illegal immigration, as if to indicate that illegal immigrants are some small class of exceptions. However, unauthorized immigrants now make up nearly about a fourth of the immigrant population of the United States. And the US today has a labor regime which is deeply dependent on undocumented immigrant labor. This is especially true in sectors such as agriculture, where unauthorized immigrants make up over 40% of farm workers. What happens if you kick these people out? You're literally the people putting food on America's table. Meanwhile, Congress has routinely failed to enact the kind of substantial reform which would bring them safely out of the shadows. This is largely because I think that nobody can really seem to agree what reform means. Immigration reform seems to be just a word that gets bandied about, and everybody means something different by it. So many people see undocumented immigrants as victims of exploitative labor practices and heavily bureaucratic, difficult to maneuver immigration procedures, which are both costly and all but impossible to navigate if you want to do things right. Others see them as criminals, right, for their violation of U.S. immigration law and demand that they be punished and that their entry be prevented. Indeed, immigrants of all stripes have long been associated with crime, as we've kind of seen over the course of this lecture. Donald Trump went so far as to characterize all immigrants, and specifically those entering on so-called lottery visas, as quote-unquote murderers and rapists. Some of them may be good people, he said, and intimated that they were being expelled by countries who wanted to empty their jails, right? Um, this is in fact an old trope in immigration history, right? It was widely rumored in the 19th century that Italy was emptying its jails by shipping immigrants to the USA. While if these rumors were false in the 19th century, at least one nation did indeed use America to empty its jails. That would be England in the 17th and 18th centuries, right? Which sentenced and shipped tens, if not hundreds of thousands of its undesirables, such as beggars, the homeless, and petty offenders, to work in its colonies in North America and later Australia. Those people now call themselves Americans and Australians and consider themselves respectable, white, hardworking people. Yeah. It's also I think ironic that Donald Trump's great grandfather Frederick Trump not only made a success in part through operating things like brothels, right, but after he was kind of returned to Germany, he had to flee back to America when authorities accused him of originally leaving to avoid military service, right? Um, it's easy to take pokes at Donald Trump, but I mean the history behind his family is also telling in terms of who is and who isn't considered a quote-unquote good immigrant and why. Of course, charges of criminality are amongst immigrants are largely belied by the data, right? So here you see two key indicators which suggest that immigrants commit legal infractions, they commit crimes far less often than their native-born counterparts, right? Um, conservatives often try to throw in illegal border crossings as crimes in themselves, right, in order to inflate these figures. That's a classification error, which is a common way in which people try to lie with statistics, I'd say. Um, the kind of misconception that immigrants are somehow criminal is deep and racialized and kind of, I'd say, stereotyped roots in the cultural psyche, which are being preyed on there. But by and large, folks who come here, or come not here, but to the United States, but also I think here to Europe as well, they don't want to be deported. They don't get involved in serious criminality. Um, there's some kind of, usually what you find is that like kind of the media will have a tendency to pick up on exceptional cases, right? and kind of report on them so often that people start to generate an association of um, 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 immigrants with crime. Sometimes, reporting on stories which turn out not to be true. I remember a couple years back there was a case in Germany where a young teenage girl, I guess she got caught by her parents for doing something wrong, coming home late or something, and she made up the excuse that she had been raped by an immigrant, and this turned out to be completely false, but it was reported on so widely in the German media that it became a huge deal. I'd also note that no group is without criminals, right? You can take any slice of any society, you will find a murderer in it. You can look at lawyers, you will find murderers. You can look at university students, you'll find somebody who's committed serious crimes, right? It's just kind of interesting that this group, which seems not to be heavily engaged in criminal activities, nevertheless oftentimes is viewed as intrinsically criminal. So still others kind of argue that immigrants are a burden on taxpayers and that competition with immigrants with immigrant labor hurts the native-born working class. But studies consistently show that immigrants contribute more on average to the economy than native-born residents, especially in the U.S. Uh, Immigrants oftentimes tend to be more highly educated, right? They have like oftentimes bachelor's degrees at higher rates, or advanced degrees close to the rates or even higher rates than the native-born population. This has to do with the kind of specific conditions put in place by the 1964 Immigration Act. Um, so what happens is that immigrants actually seem to contribute more on average to the economy than native-born residents, and take less in terms of social support, right? And therefore seem to have a very minimal impact on the wages of the native-born. I guess there are exceptions to this, right? Where you have maybe a situation where you have a large stream of people all at once going all to one place, right? And this will have for a short time a deflationary impact on wages for the very, very lowest people on the very bottom rung on the economic ladder, but that seems to go away very quickly in the medium term. There's also, I think, as I kind of gestured towards earlier, a big difference in terms of, you know, who is actually immigrating to the United States, right? So you see here again, I mentioned it briefly before that um, there's, college graduates amongst the foreign-born tend to be higher, right, than the native-born population. I think this kind of undermines the notion that, first off, that the people that immigrants are competing with exclusively are native-born low-class workers, um, or that somehow the people who are immigrating are, yeah, somehow inferior. Um, and there's also kind of, um, you know, reason to think that the composition of the immigrant population has changed to such a degree that the stereotypes surrounding immigrants and who immigrants are don't really fit anymore at all. You see fewer people, for example, migrating from places like Mexico. You see more people coming from places like Asia. Um, you also see kind of in terms of Latin American immigration, people fleeing not for reasons, or people coming to the U.S. not to work as low-wage migrants in the farm seasons anymore. Those people have largely settled in the U.S. because it became hard to go back and forth. Um, but that they largely come for reasons of political asylum, right? Or for asylum from especially difficult situations. They're basically, many of them are from Central America and are seeking refugee status. I'll talk about that more in a second. So, while there has been a lot of kind of legislation passed, especially at the end of the 20th century, nothing seems to really address the kind of continuing particular problems created by this particular Yeah, legal regime governing immigration that came out after the 60s, right? So in fact, although you see here the 1986 Bill Immigration Reform and Control Act uh, provided amnesty and a path to legal status for about 2.7 million immigrants. Um, and the 1990 Immigration Act raised legal admission for employment purposes. These acts also included deeply punitive measures which sought to enforce immigration policy by threatening to punish first employers and later immigrants themselves. Um, Several bills have also been introduced since these to bring immigration policy further in line with reality, but they consistently get shot down, right? So immigration reform, at least in terms of legislation, tends to be piecemeal, right? And I think that because of this, you see that the executive branch seems to be, especially in the 20th century, increasingly willing to step into the legislative vacuum that results. A very, I think, important example of this is uh, the 2012 Obama initiative, or it was an executive action which created DACA, right, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, and it provided relief from deportation for children brought into the U.S. without documentation by their parents. We call these people the Dreamers, right? So if you see in the media a discussion of the Dreamers, it's referring to this. This act is currently, or this executive action is currently kind of, I think a judge in Texas kind of said, no, this might not be constitutional because Congress didn't actually enact it, but I think that's being challenged still in courts. So I think that the fact that this kind of executive action was made in 2012 and has lots of popularity, right? Yet has not been kind of codified by the Congress is kind of telling, and it kind of puts these people, many of whom are in their 20s, right? They're around the age of many of you. It has kind of turned them into political pawns in a way which I think is very wrong. Um, so Trump actually, for example, tried to roll back this policy and it deported about 700,000 people. um, that didn't happen, but now we kind of see legal challenges to the ongoing existence of DACA. Um, the notion that maybe the people who are already on the program can stay, but nobody new can be added, for example, I think is the ruling of one of the courts more recently. I think it's also kind of worth noting that we should not sing the Obama administration's praises too much here because the Obama era did not benefit all immigrants equally. So aside from beefing up border control, right, the Obama administration also effectively revoked the so-called wet foot, dry foot rule, which shut down avenues for Cuban refugees to seek legal status in the USA. I think Obama was also called at some point the deporter in chief, right? Because he ramped up deportations of those who were considered to be in the country illegally. I think, however, that Cuba is an interesting case study in American refugee policy and how it intersects with foreign policy and international relations, right? So basically, the U.S. provided sanctuary for many decades for refugees fleeing Castro's Cuba, and at times even provided transportation to them. But as the profile of Cuban refugees began to change, with educated and wealthy families who were kind of trying to flee Cuba at the beginning, being eventually replaced more recently by less educated, poorer people, especially males, Cubans in the popular imaginary have kind of gone from being seen as like a welcome set of political exiles in the 1960s, to joining the ranks of so-called illegal immigrants more recently, uh, maybe starting even in the 1990s, I would say. And of course, the Trump era was big on immigration. I mean, the border wall was kind of a symbolic gesture by Trump regarding the notion of shutting down immigration altogether into the country. I think he kind of really dug deep into the kind of archive of anxieties and cultural tropes and narratives that we've kind of discussed in this lecture, in order to kind of energize a white middle and lower, and to some degree lower class base, who held kind of long-standing fears of immigrants. I also think that it's worth noting that, not starting with Trump, but especially Trump in particular, took full advantage of this tendency that kind of in the, in light of the kind of failure of, Congress to enact legislation, it seems like the executive branch has more and more been taking over immigration policy, and you really see that in the Trump era, right? You see all of these different kinds of executive actions taken to bypass Congress in order to kind of exert pressure on immigration policies. If you add to this what are, in my view, a slew of very dubious laws passed in the wake of 9/11, things begin to look kind of grim, right? So although most of these laws, for example, the USA Patriot Act is very famous, the Homeland Security Act, right? Um, Most of these laws pronounce upon immigration policy in some way, but they do little to nothing, I think, to help to alleviate the situation for undocumented workers in the United States, and instead mostly serve to beef up domestic surveillance and security at the border, right? So you see a kind of shift from treating immigration, shift towards treating immigration through a security lens, right, which happens in the wake of 9/11. Indeed, although politicians have been increasingly boisterous about stopping a supposed flood of immigration, the own data suggests that in fact there are far fewer undocumented entries in the wake of the Great Recession. That's changed more recently, I think, during the pandemic. I'll talk about that in a second. What is kind of noticeable, however, is that border security, in terms of both dollars spent and persons employed, has just skyrocketed in a way which I think is kind of shows a mismatch, right? You see lots and lots of money going towards border protection agencies like the BPA, um, but they weren't really apprehending lots of people compared to prior years, right? Um, I think that this had to do with the kind of slowdown of the American economy during the Great Recession. One reason that the US saw the decline in undocumented immigrant apprehensions at the US border during the Great Recession is that undocumented immigrants, especially coming from Mexico, are increasingly not seasonal migrants, right? Some of them are asylum seekers. I'll talk about that in a minute. But most of those who used to be kind of considered seasonal migrants going over the U.S.-Mexico border every year, they instead settled in the U.S. and became long-term residents, paid taxes, raised families. They participate in their communities, right? And you can kind of see this here in terms of the short-term residence decline and the long-term residence rise as share of U.S. unauthorized immigrants. So you see that reflected here in this graph. So up until only very recently, data really suggested that more and more undocumented migrants aren't even coming into the U.S. via the Mexican border anyway, right? They're simply entering the U.S. legally with visas and overstaying those visas, right? And it kind of makes sense. Why would you cross a desert on foot when you can just buy a plane ticket and take a boat? The exception to this are those who, if you look on this bottom hand, uh, uh, or if you look at this this chart in this map on the right hand side, you'll see that the exception here is the Rio Grande, right? So those who are kind of really um, most kind of desperate to cross the border are often doing so in this area, which is especially dangerous, by the way, um, because, well, you can drown, right? And you also have to go through a substantial amount of desert afterwards. In recent months, there have been kind of surges of unauthorized immigration happening at the border. Of course, this is a big political nightmare, right, for the Biden administration, and Republicans are latching onto it. I actually am of the opinion that mm, presidents themselves have very little control over waves of immigration, right? You did see, for example, that during the pandemic, there was kind of a lull in this kind of immigration, and only recently, kind of this last summer, has it picked up again in months when you don't expect to see it pick up, right? Usually you expect the traditional kind of model would have been that, um, especially undocumented immigrants who are coming to work for a season, right? Seasonal migrant laborers would come in the spring, right? Instead, you see right now, for example, lots of immigrants massing at the border who are not able to get in because of very restrictive entry policies which are in place at the moment because of the pandemic, ostensibly, um, um, getting kind of stuck there. Um, and they seem to be pretty much what we would consider refugees, right? Of various kinds, right? They're fleeing either different kinds of environmental devastation or political upheaval. Haiti is an example. A lot of Haitians right now seems on the border. There are also kind of political instability and fleeing, for example, gangs. Tends to be a big thing in Central America, right? You might remember Donald Trump talking about caravans coming from Guatemala, for example. Um, these seem to be people who are bringing also um, not just you usually see adult men if you think about just seasonal migrants, but what you have here are kind of also encounters with minors, right? So entire families coming. This is you also probably remember Trump's family separation policy, which was meant to be kind of this punitive attempt to uh, convince people not to come because they was going to be separated from their kids. There's also kind of a legal justification behind this, but most people don't really buy it. Um, yeah. So this is kind of where we stand now. Yeah, and here you see just kind of a question of like who's really trying to cross. You have family apprehensions at the border, right? And if you look at where they're coming from, not many are coming from Mexico, many are coming from other countries, right? Which kind of goes to say that this seems to be a wave of immigration which is happening not so much out of purely pull factors to the US for work purposes or uh, things like that, but rather people kind of being pushed out of or feeling like they need to flee their place of origin and go to somewhere like the United States where they think they will have um, better, more safety, more security, where they will escape, for example, gangs who want to recruit their kids or take them away and sell them or whatever it may be. So even though you have this huge influx of people who seem to be mostly asylum seekers, right, refugees of various kinds, um, uh, the kind of huge waves don't seem to be matched by huge numbers of admissions, right? Um, Here you see on the left-hand side the kind of annual ceiling of refugees um, that are kind of, put as a quota for the U.S. to allow in, and the number of admitted refugees, the people who are actually allowed in as refugees. And yeah, we kind of see that even though the ceiling is going up after the Biden administration, the Trump administration had pushed it down for many years running. It had also kind of tried to clog up the um, immigration court system through various means in order to kind of, I don't know, use various kinds of bureaucratic mechanisms in order to try to keep people from winning asylum claims and gaining refugee status and instead deporting them. You see that even though the annual ceiling has been raised, I think also we have to take into account people who will be seeking asylum from places like Afghanistan after the US has withdrawn from that country and kind of left it in the hands of the Taliban. You see that although that ceiling is up, so far the number of admitted refugees is down, which means that people's cases aren't getting processed, which is one of the things that's creating that huge, huge buildup of people at the border and this crisis that we keep hearing about, right? So a lot of people tend to I tend to kind of associate poor immigration policy with Republican presidencies. I'm not sure that Biden really has his hands around this issue yet. Um, You'd have also seen kind of in years leading up to this moment that um, migrants seeking asylum have been instead placed in deportation proceedings. One of the reasons for this is that the asylum process in the United States is really complicated. It revolves many different steps. It usually requires legal representation. There's not a lot of people who are going to represent, especially lawyers who are going to represent asylum seekers for free. So those who do that kind of work are completely overwhelmed. Um, there's this long drawn out process which was put in place kind of as part of this kind of turn to a security framing of immigration policy, right? Where they have to kind of pass various interviews with officers who will try to assess if they have actually a credible reason to be afraid and can come into the country. It's worth noting that most of the reasons why people can enter the country have to do with kind of imminent fear of violence or political persecution in the home country, not fleeing disasters, right? So it's questionable, for example, if you can get, if after an earthquake or something like that destroys your country, if you're going to be taken care of, and also for employment options, right? So people who literally maybe feel like they can't feed their family anymore and need to immigrate for economic purposes are usually not covered by asylum policies. Um, you can see here on the far right the who seems to be getting asylum grants. You see China, Venezuela very far up there. You can think about China because of crackdowns on pro-democracy or pro-open society activists. Venezuela, of course, we all know the political kind of situation in Venezuela is very bad right now. Salvador, Guatemala, Egypt, India, Honduras, Turkey, so forth. I think it's also kind of worth noting that the American public has mixed and constantly shifting views on asylum seeking and refugees, right? Um, so, for example, if you look at uh, refugees from Cuba, right, in the 1980s, there was very low approval rating, very high disapproval rating of whether or not the U.S. should accept more refugees. If you look at the kind of Kosovo conflict, right? You had ethnic Albanians. People tended to support that more. You can question yourself. We can ask questions all day and maybe even do research about why that might be. Syrians more recently in 2017. I think there's if we were to add Afghanistanis to this, people fleeing Afghanistan as the Taliban is kind of moving back into control, you would see probably something similar. A lot of people support that. They have a sense of, I don't know, especially military type folks, but there are those who don't. Um, it, you know, the view on accepting refugees oftentimes plays into politics in very important ways and can have an impact on immigration policy as well. So it's something to keep in mind. So that brings me to my conclusion for this section, which is that, so in the wake of congressional failures to pass or even agree on the meaning of substantial immigration reform, we have an executive branch which has been empowered by post 9/11 legislation, which seems increasingly comfortable with and capable of taking unilateral and oftentimes decidedly punitive action on immigration policy. Yeah. Um, you can think about Trump's deterrence policies, right? Making it just really bad if you try to cross the border, right? You can also think about Biden's kind of pandemic era policies of which are, he changed many things about the Trump policy again by executive action. Yeah. So you see that the executive seems to be playing more and more part of immigration policy. But in any case, well, he did kind of roll back some of the more, I'd say, detrimental, but punitive, maybe the better word, um, um, Trump policies. He has held in place, for example, a ban because of, or kind of an attempt to halt certain kinds of entries because of the pandemic. Yeah. Um, so I think just in closing and in keeping with the subtitle of this presentation, I want to end thinking a little bit about just what the controversies are here. Yeah, so I think that, all of these kinds of punitive or security-minded actions, or executive actions, are very often justified by appealing to the rhetoric of crisis, right? So either the crisis of the pandemic, the crisis of immigration, the crisis of terrorism, right? And indeed, in both the U.S. and Europe, the notion that we're experiencing a crisis of immigration has become, it's almost trite, right, at this point. Um, that rhetoric, however, is in no way new, right? Anti-immigration legislation may at times be a sensible route for particular countries in particular situations at particular moments, but there's no lack of examples from history in which it follows not from rational deliberation, but from the onset of some kind of moral panic. Yeah, and oftentimes that moral panic is infused with kind of undertones and anxieties which are based in kind of racist, sometimes classist um, um, misperceptions, let's say. So if there's really, I think, a global crisis of immigration happening today, and I think there might be, um, it's one which is felt first and foremost not by the people, the native-born populations of places which are very nice and secure, like Northern Europe or the United States. It's felt first and foremost by immigrants and refugees themselves, right? Not by those who are in a position to help them. Um, and I think it's worth noting that many of those nations where people are trying to come, right, to flee whatever it might be, environmental destruction, political turmoil, um, macroeconomic uh, uh, um, 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 recessions. A lot of the kind of countries like the United States, Western European powers, they hold no small amount of responsibility for creating these instabilities. Yeah, for creating the kind of political crises through interventions or war, right? The economic kind of long-term economic consequences of colonialism, for example, um, the disasters which are uh, kind of coming about because of climate change and which are falling disproportionately upon those places which were, well, for example, former colonies, right? Or places in which Western states decided to use as theaters of war, sometimes proxy battles, right, between great powers or um, regions which were kind of competing with each other. And those are the kind of conditions which drive people and immigrants from their homelands often in the first place, right? So that's all to say that I think we should keep in mind, right, the degree to which immigration is not something that happens, and mass immigration, especially crisis levels of immigration, is not something that just happens. People generally like to stay where they are. Yeah, they usually move because of structural reasons. Yeah, and if we don't take into account those structural reasons, we are very easily fooled by those who would like to take advantage of the situation um, and use very old and very powerful tropes and narratives um, uh, uh, um, about and fears about the inherent difference in inferiority and sometimes violence or whatever it might be of quote unquote others in order to achieve their own kind of political ends. Yeah. So I'm going to end with that. Thanks everybody for listening. I can't wait to discuss some of this in our seminars. Um, Take care, and I will see those of you in my seminar later this week and the rest of you sometime soon. Thanks and bye.